Slide titled Introduction. This video presentation dealing with globalization and international political economy was recorded by Mike Corrali in Santa Rosa, California. All citations, including an annotated bibliography, as well as acknowledgments of all other authors' contributions toward the formulation of this lecture, are available freely upon request. Slide titled Seminar Question. Opening today's newspaper, please select a news item that gives evidence of the advance or retreat of globalization as you now understand it by virtue of the elements described herein. Slide titled The Rise of Globalization. Globalization has bound people, countries, and markets closer than ever, rendering national borders relics of a bygone era. Or so we're told. But a close look at the data reveals a world that's just a fraction as integrated as the one we thought we knew. Globalization is not some formal structure of the current international system from which countries may decide to opt in or opt out. It's not a meaningless catch-all buzzword. It's not imposed by some menacing oppressor, nor is it necessarily a good or bad thing in and of itself. Globalization is a process that results in the growing interconnectedness of the world. Globalization can be defined in a variety of ways, but the most common understanding of the term is the increasing interdependence of economies, political systems, and societies on a global scale. As Matthew Crane points out so adeptly in his excellent essay titled Globalization, despite popular misconceptions, the process is usually understood to be driven by technological innovations that allow for greater interconnectedness between and among people, groups, countries, and international and transnational organizations. Noted economist Tom Friedman points out that globalization is the integration of capital, technology, and information across national borders in a way that is creating a single global market and, to some degree, a global village. The result is a world that seems even smaller and a pace of interaction that seems, at times, even faster. That being said, some scholars argue that while globalization has become a defining feature of the international economy, the extent and significance of economic globalization have been greatly exaggerated and misunderstood in both public and professional discussions. Globalization has bound people, countries, and markets closer than ever, rendering national borders relics of a bygone era. Or so we're told. But a close look at the data reveals a world that's just a fraction as integrated as the one we thought we knew. Globalization, they argue, is in fact not nearly as extensive nor as sweeping in its consequences, negative or positive, as many contemporary observers believe. This is still a world where national policies and domestic economies are the principal determinants of economic affairs. Yes, globalization and increasing economic interdependence among national economies are indeed very important. But as we'll discuss in a moment, the economic achievement of the post-World War II era has been to restore the level of economic integration that had existed prior to World War I. In other words, national systems of political economy still have a profound effect on domestic and international economic affairs. As national economies have become more and more integrated, in fact, the significance of the fundamental differences among political systems and national economies has greatly increased. Slide titled, "A Mark, a Yen, a Buck, or a Pound." A marvelous example of this 1992 situation where private investors suddenly and without much warning transferred huge sums of money out of the British pound, the Italian lira, and other currencies into the German mark, thereby forcing unwanted devaluation. Many observers believe the subsequent financial crisis demonstrated the triumph of transnational economic forces and economic globalization over the nation-state. Some allege that national governments are rapidly losing their economic autonomy and have even become hostage to global market forces and the whims of international speculators. Could it be that if a national government fails to heed the interests of the controllers of international capital, the errant government will not be able to obtain the capital required to carry out its economic and political plans? Are national governments' sovereignty being replaced or superseded by international players? Countering this argument, another interpretation of the 1992 crisis mentioned above emphasizes the role of government decisions and political developments in convincing international investors that the currency situation in Western Europe was highly unstable, forcing their hands to act. The 1990 decision to eliminate intra-European barriers to capital flows increased the rise of speculation. The Brits had kept their pound overvalued. The Americans had lowered interest rates to stimulate a stagnant economy, and the Germans raised their interest rate to offset the inflationary consequences of German reunification. Indeed, this was a perfect storm for investors to act, but it was all predicated on rational political decisions made by the governments in their own interests. One of the dominant themes in the study of global political economy is the persistent clash between the increasing interdependence of the international economy and the desire of individual nation-states to maintain their economic independence and political autonomy. At the same time that the nation-states want the benefits of free trade, foreign investment, and the like, they also desire to protect their political autonomy, cultural values, and social structures. Whereas powerful market forces, I'm thinking trade, finance, and investment, jump political boundaries and integrate societies, governments frequently restrict and channel their economic activities to serve the interests of their own societies and of powerful groups within those societies. Whereas the logic of the market is to locate economic activities wherever they will be most efficient and profitable, the logic of the nation-state is to capture and control the process of economic growth and capital accumulation in order to increase the power and economic welfare of the nation. The inevitable clash between the logic of the market and the logic of the nation-state is central to the study of global political economy and globalism writ large. Slide titled, Visualizing Globalization. Visualizing globalization as a process that generates an increasingly complex web of interconnections, or a dense network of international flows of goods, services, capital, information, people, and ideas, implies both a broadening of these interconnections across borders and a deepening of the intensity and importance of these ties. The effects of policies or events are felt by a wider range of people and countries and have a more substantial impact on who are affected than ever before. Issues that once affected a country or a region now have broader implications. Moreover, issues themselves are now more interrelated than ever before. Each actor in the international system is tied together more closely and in numerous ways. As a result, each becomes more sensitive to the decisions and actions of others and more vulnerable to the effects of others' choices and actions. This increasing sensitivity and vulnerability requires nation-states to think about policy changes in new ways and allows other countries and non-state actors new ways to influence outcomes around the globe. Governments face pressures from other countries likely to be affected by their policy choices, from international organizations, from transnational actors, and from other cross-border groups below the level of the nation-state. Regardless whether one is a blue-collar worker in Britain or a merchant in Iran, a peasant farmer in Chiapas or an oligarch in Russia, a multinational corporation or an activist, an individual or a government, or whether one considers one's primary allegiance to be one's job, city or region, ethnic group, religious group, country or larger global community, the question is not whether one is affected by globalization, but rather how. Slide titled Globalization 1.0. A brief review of world history suggests that globalization is an ongoing process that has unfolded in the past in ways remarkably similar in form, if not in content, to the present. For example, what the Europeans called the Age of Discovery was simply the globalization of its day, or what we'll call Globalization 1.0. Columbus and his contemporaries were attempting to upgrade access to global markets, in their case, by finding a faster route to India. They were able to attempt this because of technological innovations in the leading sectors of their economy. Back then, the development of cheaper, faster, sturdier ships enabled the flow of highly valued goods such as spices and gold. Today, the development of cheaper, faster, sturdier microelectronics enables the flow of highly prized information. The story of globalization of any age is a story of technological innovation leading to greater global integration. What has changed dramatically over time is how complex and extensive this web of interconnections has become. Issues that were once dealt with in isolation must now be thought of as being linked to other issues. For example, economic policies may have environmental impacts. Environmental policies may have social impacts, and social policies have political ramifications, all of which are likely to affect the original economic condition that the economic policy was formulated to deal with in the first place. Where once nation-states worried about the domestic consequences of their own domestic policies, they must now consider international, regional, and local impacts and restrictions. There have been 3 tectonic power shifts in the last 500 years, fundamental changes in the distribution of power that have reshaped international life. It's politics, economics, and culture. The first was the rise of the Western world, a process that began in the 15th century and accelerated dramatically in the late 18th century. It produced modernity as we know it: science, technology, commerce and capitalism, the agriculture and then the industrial revolutions. It also produced the prolonged political dominance of the nations in the West. The second shift, which took place in the closing years of the 19th century, was the rise of the United States. Soon after it industrialized, the United States became the most powerful nation since Imperial Rome, and the only one that was stronger than any likely combination of other nations. For most of the last century, the United States has dominated global economics, politics, science, and culture. For the last 25 years, that dominance has been unrivaled, a phenomenon unprecedented in modern history. Slide titled Globalization 2.0. The first level of integration in Globalism 2.0 was in immigration, especially from the 1870s through the 1920s. As I describe in my book, Trouble at the Border, a contextual approach to the study of immigration policy in the United States, immigration before World War I was pretty seamless if you were a European. If you were coming from most European ports, you could immigrate to the U.S. with no papers, no passport. All you had to do, really, was show up, prove that you weren't an anarchist, prove that you had no communicable disease or were mentally ill. Now, migration from Asia and the New World were highly controlled, indeed, but European migration was wide open. The flow, then, not only of labor, but, if you think of it, ideas and culture and an entrepreneurial spirit was free-flowing. The second level of integration in Globalism 2.0, let's say from the 1800s to 2000, was on the monetary front. The gold standard is a monetary system in which the representative currency is based on a fixed amount of gold held by the central government. All main European currencies were on the gold standard, easing trade. In other words, the gold standard is rather like having a common currency, analogous to the euro. The only two main countries that weren't on the gold standard were China and Persia. Now, I don't want to paint too rosy a picture. This is also the era of Dickens, of the Industrial Revolution and the potato famine. It was a period of severe colonization and colonialism, mass starvation, and miserable living and working conditions. There was a consensus among the leaders of the time that this migration and fiscal integration was a good thing and should continue. And yet it all came crashing down in the space of a few months in 1914 with the crash of the fine balance among the great powers of Europe, known as the Concert of Europe, brought about by the Congress of Vienna and the advent of World War I. There were attempts to rebuild the classic economic order and integration after World War I that were moderately successful, but then 1929 came along and the entire structure of the world economy collapsed over the space of a few months. For 5 years, all the world's major countries worked to stop the downward economic spiral, but nothing seemed to work. By 1933, world trade was at 1/3 of what it was at the start of what was a mild recession in October of 1929. So the world order that existed prior to World War I was the tightest that had ever been known to that point. Prosperity was relatively high by the standards of the day. So we might ask ourselves why an international economic order that was in many regards so successful collapsed and could not be restored. And what are the implications of Globalization 2.0 for our studies of Globalization 3.0 today? Globalization is not an external state of affairs. It comes and it goes. our ancestors also lived in a highly globalized world economy, as noted above, but also one that was often very closed. Integration is not a normal or natural state of affairs. During the 19th century, it was not uncommon to think the world economy was self-correcting, self-balancing, and self-equilibrating. That might have been true in specific markets of the economy. Let's say the market for steel, the market for wheat, or the market for textiles. But the world economy as a whole turned out not to be self-correcting. What they came to realize was that it was held together as an economic order because the major powers cooperated with one another. In other words, international economic integration had political foundations. Cooperation among major economic powers included domestic support for engagement with the world economy. The nation-states would cooperate to foster success. If there were a run on the bank in Germany, they could turn to the Bank of France or the Bank of England or the Bank of Austria-Hungary. Thus, the international economic order relied very heavily upon cooperation among the major powers. That, in turn, relied upon a general agreement among the major powers that making sacrifices at the national level in order to maintain involvement at the international level was something worth doing. If your economy was undergoing difficulties and you had to impose austerities in order to maintain your position in the world economy, you did it. However, after World War I, the major powers could no longer agree how to keep the international system together. The three principal pillars of the economy prior to World War I had been France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, England. After World War I, two of these three pillars could no longer agree on anything. France and Germany continued to fight through the 1920s and the 1930s. What had separated them on the field of battle now continued to separate them at the conference table. More importantly, by the end of World War I, the U.S. had become the most important economy in the world. It went from being the biggest borrower to being the biggest lender. The U.S. now comes to dominate the world economy, but America is about to walk away from the table. During the 1930s, the combination of the Great Depression and the memory of tragic losses in World War I contributed to pushing America's public opinion and policy toward isolationism. Isolationists advocated non-involvement in European and Asian conflicts and non-engagement in international politics. Although the United States took measures to avoid political and military conflicts across the oceans, it continued to expand economically and to protect its interests in Latin America. The leaders of the isolationist movement drew upon history to bolster their positions. For example, in his farewell address, President George Washington had advocated non-involvement in European wars and politics. For much of the 19th century, the expanse of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans had made it possible for the United States to enjoy a kind of free security and remain largely detached from old world conflicts. During World War I, however, President Woodrow Wilson made a case for U.S. intervention in the conflict and a U.S. interest in maintaining a peaceful world order. Nevertheless, the American experience in that war served to bolster the arguments of isolationists. They argued that marginal U.S. interests in that conflict did not justify the number of U.S. casualties. In the wake of World War I, a report by Senator Gerald P. Nye, a Republican from North Dakota, fed this belief by claiming that American bankers and arms manufacturers had pushed for U.S. involvement for their own profit. The 1934 publication of the book Merchants of Death by H.C. Engelbrecht and F.C. Hagenhen, followed by the 1935 tract, quote, War is a Racket, unquote, by decorated Marine Corps General Smedley D. Butler, both served to increase popular suspicions of wartime profiteering and influence public opinion in the direction of neutrality. Many Americans became determined not to be tricked by banks and industries into making such great sacrifices again. The reality of a worldwide economic depression and the need for increased attention to domestic problems only served to bolster the idea that the United States should isolate itself from troubling events in Europe. During the interwar period, the U.S. government repeatedly chose non-entanglement over participation or intervention as the appropriate response to international questions. Immediately following World War I, Congress rejected U.S. membership in the League of Nations. Some members of Congress opposed membership in the League out of concern that it would draw the United States into European conflicts, although ultimately the Collective Security Clause sank the possibility of U.S. participation. During the 1930s, the League proved ineffectual in the face of growing militarism, partly due to the U.S. decision not to participate. The advent of World War II drew the U.S. out of its isolation and back onto the world economic stage. In the immediate post-World War II period, Europe remained ravaged by war and thus susceptible to exploitation by an internal and external communist threat. In a June 1947 speech to the graduating class at Harvard University, Secretary of State George C. Marshall issued a call for a comprehensive program to rebuild Europe. Fanned by the fear of communist expansion and the rapid deterioration of European economies in the winter of 1946-47, Congress passed the Economic Cooperation Act in March of 1948 and approved funding that would eventually rise to over $12 billion for the rebuilding of Western Europe. The Marshall Plan generated a resurgence of European industrialization and brought extensive investment into the region. It was also a stimulant to the U.S. economy by establishing markets for American goods. Although the participation of the Soviet Union and East European nations was an initial possibility, Soviet concern over potential U.S. economic domination of its Eastern European satellites and Joseph Stalin's unwillingness to open up his secret society to Westerners doomed the idea. Furthermore, it is unlikely that the U.S. Congress would have been willing to fund the plan as generally as it did if aid also went to the Soviet bloc communist nations. Thus, the Marshall Plan was applied solely to Western Europe, precluding any measure of Soviet bloc cooperation. Increasingly, the economic revival of Western Europe, especially West Germany, was viewed suspiciously in Moscow. Economic historians have debated the precise impact of the Marshall Plan on Western Europe, but these differing opinions do not detract from the fact that the Marshall Plan has been recognized as a great humanitarian effort. Secretary of State Marshall became the only general ever to receive a Nobel Prize for Peace. The Marshall Plan also institutionalized and legitimized the concept of U.S. foreign aid programs, which have become an integral part of U.S. foreign policy. The global economy grew from 1945 until 1991 along the strong lines of the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain formed an imaginary boundary dividing Europe into two separate areas from the end of World War II in 1945 until the end of the Cold War in 1991. The term symbolized efforts by the Soviet Union to block itself and its satellite states from open contact with the West and non-Soviet controlled areas. On the east side of the Iron Curtain were the countries connected to or influenced by the Soviet Union. On either side of the Iron Curtain, states developed their own international economic and military alliances. Member countries of the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance and the Warsaw Pact, with the Soviet Union as the leading state, and members of the countries of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, with the United States as the preeminent power. Physically, the Iron Curtain took the form of border defenses between the countries of Europe in the middle of the continent. The most notable border was marked by the Berlin Wall and its Checkpoint Charlie, which served as a symbol of the curtain as a whole. With the fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent fall of the Soviet Union, a new era in globalization began. Along with economist and historian Thomas Friedman, author of The World is Flat, let's call this new era Globalization 3.0. Slide titled Globalization 3.0. In his excellent examination of Globalization 3.0, Thomas Friedman cites 10 key turning points that led us to a new globalist threshold. His list begins in November 9th, 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the introduction of IBM PCs and Windows operating system. Freedom in East Germany and German reunification were breathtaking developments, which we had always hoped for, but did not really expect to happen in our lifetime, in my lifetime for sure. The political division of the world into the Soviet bloc and the West had been pretty firmly established. Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika policies in the Soviet Union and the states it controlled actually set things in motion, and it came as a surprise to us all. Gorbachev loosened the grip of the Soviet bloc, and that sealed the fate of the East German government. Mass protests against the government in East Germany, long considered too risky, initially called out for political, economic, and social reforms, but then for reunification. West Germany's Chancellor Helmut Kohl and East Germany's new government strongly supported above all the U.S. administration of George Herbert Walker Bush, showing a great resolve and leadership. Reunification became reality with astonishing speed. Fortunately, there was really no outbreak of violence on November 9th, 1989, the day the Berlin Wall was actually opened. The following day, many of the residents of East Berlin and citizens of the former German Democratic Republic crossed to West Berlin and celebrated their newfound freedom. Less than a year later, Germany had reunified. Amazing. The significance of the events can hardly be overestimated. Along with Germany's reunification and the economic reconstruction of the former East German states, the Soviet Union fell apart, and Russia turned to embrace democracy and a market economy, with many countries in Eastern Europe following suit. European integration progressed rapidly, and the euro was launched. The European Union was enlarged to comprise 27 member states. With trade between East and West blossoming, investment flowed eastward, while wealth and democracy progressed significantly in the countries of the former Soviet bloc. Some Eastern Europeans and East Germans moved westward, but on balance, large-scale imbalances and risks were avoided. Since 1989, per capita income has substantially risen in all these countries. Levels of prosperity have increased considerably, and most transition countries in Eastern Europe have become stable democracies. Germany is a different place today as well. East Germany has made substantial progress. Slide titled Flatteners. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the transition to democracy and market economics in most Eastern European countries have changed international affairs forever. The former confrontational stance of heavily armed superpowers is now a thing of the past, having been replaced by more nuanced international relations. The rise of China, India, and other big emerging market countries has substantially changed the global interrelations of economic and political power. Undisputedly an historical watershed, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 marked the start of a new era of globalization and geopolitics. Furthermore, in a pivotal deal with IBM in 1980, Microsoft created the PC-DOS operating system for a fee of, get this, $80,000. Recognizing that other PC makers might attempt to copy it, Microsoft retained the operating system's copyrights. Eventually, Microsoft's MS-DOS became the foundation of the Windows OS that propelled the company's personal computing vision around the world. Through partnerships with PC makers, Windows became the dominant PC OS in businesses and homes around the globe. Microsoft grew from a company that employed just about 30 people to a multi-billion-dollar global force that employs 124,000 individuals and affects business, social, and global change. With user-friendly tools like Windows, Office, MS Paint, Microsoft was successful in making computing, something that was remote and foreign to most people, a personal and easy experience. Consumers and businesses also benefited from the fact that Microsoft's platform became the development box and the target of a massive community of developers who ultimately supplied Windows with 16 million programs. Microsoft not only put a PC in every home and on every desk, but was crucial to defining the relationships between platform providers, developers, businesses, and consumers that really are the foundations of the present age of personal computing. Microsoft maintained personal computing to the extent that PCs are now available in a range of forms and price points. The third world countries, where there is no or limited electricity, are even provided with durable wind-up PCs. PCs and Windows have become the fundamental tools that have helped authors write bestsellers, artists create masterpieces, musicians craft music, social service and volunteer organizations monitor resources, authors write and publish books, manufacturers optimize production, banks power ATMs, and much more. Their integration in almost every part of our lives has indeed changed our world. Though the PC market declined after the smartphone's advent, the existence of these modern mobile PCs is really a testimony of Microsoft's impact on the world in personal computing, especially since Microsoft's $150 million contribution to Apple in 1997, which saved Apple, the Cupertino company, enabled it to exist long enough to introduce the world-changing iPhone in 2007. Many of the world's businesses, which drive local and global economies and have intricate relationships with and impact on local and global communities, run on a Microsoft-based IT infrastructure. From Windows Server to Intune device management to Azure cloud services to Surface deployment, Office 365 and more, Microsoft is a platform that many large and small businesses around the world still run on. Secondly, in August 1985, we have the introduction of Netscape in its initial public offering, its IPO. This first broadly popular commercial browser brought the internet alive, regardless of the platform users found themselves using. But it also made it intellectually accessible to everyone from 5-year-old kids to an 85-year-old. We then had the addition of workflow software. As the wall fell and the PC, Windows, and Netscape browser enabled people to connect with other people as never before, they soon wanted to do more than just browse and send emails and IMs and listen to music and watch cat videos over this internet platform. They wanted to shape things, create things, design things, sell things, buy things, track inventories, do somebody else's taxes, read somebody's x-rays from half a world away, and they wanted to do so seamlessly. Microsoft Office, then, upon which I typed these lecture notes, offered newfound office productivity. The introduction of PayPal also made e-commerce a reality. Boy, that was a change. The advent of open sourcing in Apache brought new flexibility and access. This is a shareware program for web server technology produced for free by a bunch of geeks just working online in open source chat rooms. Remember, back then, Microsoft, IBM, Oracle, Netscape were all trying to build commercial web servers. These were huge companies investing big bucks in these processes, and suddenly, you or I could get that process off the internet for free through open sourcing. Since creating commercial software is a significant investment of a company's time and treasure, they are rightly copyrighted and sold, and companies guard the source code like the crown jewels. Open source software, conversely, is shared, constantly improved by its users, and made available for free to anyone. In return for using open source software, every user who comes up with an improvement, a patch, is encouraged to make that patch available to every other user for free. Because of Apache's proficiency at allowing a single server machine to host thousands of websites, music, data, text, photos, the ever-present cat videos, it began to command a lion's share of the internet service provider market. Today, about 2/3 of the websites in the world are built on Apache. This is an argument for open sourcing as a world flattening mechanism. Can anybody say Wikipedia? Outsourcing is an agreement in which one company hires another company to be responsible for a planned or existing activity that is or could be done internally. Phone centers, insurance claims, tax preparation, as I mentioned, reading medical x-rays, are all easily outsourced. While U.S. companies do not outsource to reduce high top-level executive or managerial costs, they primarily outsource to reduce peripheral and non-core business expenses. Further reasons to outsource would be to escape the higher taxes, high energy costs, and excessive government regulations found in a company's home country. Pros of outsourcing include reducing and controlling operating costs, improving company focus, gaining access to world-class capabilities and personnel, freeing internal resources for other purposes, streamlining or increasing efficiency for time-consuming functions, and maximizing the use of external resources. Offshoring is the practice of basing some of a company's processes or services overseas so as to take advantage of lower costs. Now, this is a great place to use Friedman's example of running with gazelles and sleeping with lions. So Friedman is very clever in this, and he describes an African scene where you have gazelles and lions waking up in the morning. When a gazelle wakes up, he or she realizes that in order to survive that day, he has to run faster than the fastest lion. When a lion wakes up, he or she realizes that he or she has to run faster than the slowest gazelle in order to survive that day. And as Freeman puts it, and it's really clever, whether you're a lion or gazelle, when you wake up, you better start running. This is the idea of offshoring and supply chaining and outsourcing, that as globalization flattens the world, as this technology and its accessibility and its availability flattens the world, we're creating a competitive world market whereby the fastest, the smartest, the most adept are going to take the day. So whether you're a lion or a gazelle, time to get running. Supply chaining is a crucial element in the development of Globalization 3.0. In commerce, supply chain management is the management of the flow of goods and services and involves the movement and storage of raw materials, of work-in-process inventory, and of finished goods from point of origin to point of consumption. Supply chain management has been defined as the design, planning, execution, control, and monitoring of supply chain activities with the objective of creating new value, building a competitive infrastructure, leveraging worldwide logistics, synchronizing supply with demand, and measuring performance globally. In this third era of globalization, attention is given to global systems of supplier relationships and the expansion of supply chains beyond national boundaries and into other continents. Although the use of global sources in organization supply chains can be traced back several decades, it wasn't until the late 1980s that a considerable number of organizations started to integrate global sources into their core businesses. This era is characterized by the globalization of supply chain management in organizations with the goal of increasing their competitive advantage, adding value, and reducing costs through global sourcing. If outsourcing is a shortcut, then insourcing is an investment. The practice of using an organization's own personnel or other resources to accomplish a task that was previously outsourced. One example is the in-house use of engineers to write technical manuals for equipment that they have designed rather than sending the work to an outside technical writing firm. Much of this lecture was written using resources readily available online. As I say, I have a comprehensive bibliography available. Some articles or books are put behind paid firewalls, to be sure, but they are readily available. Self-empowerment of the individual by virtue of the vast universe of information available on the internet is a key element of further globalization. If we take these elements and add them up and stir, we have a pretty sound argument for the advent and the advance of Globalization 3.0. However, as Friedman also suggests in his book The World is Flat, there are further elements that enhance their effect. He calls these the steroids. For example, digitization. All previously analog content and processes, everything from photography to entertainment to communication to word processing to architectural design to management of my home sprinkler system, are all now digital. While I still teach this class in person in a real-world brick-and-mortar classroom, you're listening and participating in this class in its digitized form. And it's all virtual. done at such high speeds as to appear seamless and instantaneous. And finally, all done wirelessly. And finally, all done wirelessly. For us old codgers, the idea of a mobile wireless interface is still pretty cool. Indeed, what's to say I'm not recording this lecture poolside in, I don't know, Palm Springs. Slide titled Point, Counterpoint. Being scholars worth our salt, we know that there are two sides to every story. Thomas Friedman's book that I've gone on and on about is an excellent, worthwhile examination of the forces shaping our world today. I learned a lot reading it. However, as Pungaj Gemawat points out in his 2009 article in Foreign Policy Journal, information is indeed spreading faster and leaping borders. Poor countries will have immediate access to information that was once restricted to the industrial world and traveled only slowly, if at all, beyond it. Entire electorates will learn things that once only a few bureaucrats knew. Small companies will offer services that previously only giants could provide. In all these ways, the communications revolution is profoundly democratic and liberating, leveling the imbalance between large and small, rich and poor. The global vision that Frances Cairncross predicted in her book The Death of Distance appears to be upon us. We seem to live in a world that is no longer a collection of isolated local nations, effectively separated by high tariff walls, poor communications network, and mutual suspicion. It's a world that, if you believe the most prominent proponents of globalization, is increasingly wired, informed, democratic, and, well, flat. It's an attractive idea. And if publishing trends are any indication, globalization is more than just a powerful economic and political transformation. It's a booming cottage industry. According to the U.S. Library of Congress's catalog in the 1990s, about 500 books were published on globalization. Between 2000 and 2004, there were more than 4,000. In fact, between the mid-1990s and 2003, the rate of increase in globalization-related titles more than doubled every 18 months. It sounds compelling enough. Friedman's assertions are simply the latest in a series of exaggerated visions that include the end of history and the convergence of tastes. Some writers in this vein view globalization as a good thing, an escape from the ancient tribal rifts that have divided humans, and an opportunity to sell the same thing to everyone on Earth. Others lament its cancerous spread, a process at the end of which everyone will be eating the same fast food. Their arguments are mostly characterized by emotional rather than cerebral appeals, a reliance on prophecy, semiotic arousal, that is, treating everything as a sign, a focus on technology as the driver of change, an emphasis on education that creates new people, and perhaps above all, a clamor for attention. But they all have one thing in common. Perhaps they're wrong. In truth, the world is not nearly as connected as these writers would have us believe. Despite talk of a new, wired world, where information, ideas, money, and people can move around the planet faster than ever before, just a fraction of what we consider globalization actually exists. The portrait that emerges from a hard look at the way companies, people, and states interact in this world that's only beginning to realize the potential of true global integration is fraught. And what these trends backers won't tell you is that globalization's future is more fragile than you might think. Most new users coming into technology are in the emerging world. For example, Some 726 million people, according to The Economist, came online in the past 3 years alone. China is still growing fast, indeed, but much of the rise is coming from poorer places, notably India and Africa. Having seen what quote-unquote fake news and trolling has done to the public discourse in rich countries, many observers worry about politics being debased, from the polarization of India's electorate to the persecution of Myanmar's Rohingya minority. On the positive side, charities and aid workers talk endlessly and earnestly about how smartphones will allow farmers to check crop prices, to let villagers sign up for online education, and to help doctors boost vaccination rates. Less well appreciated is the main attractions of being online are the same for the second half of the Internet's expansion as they were for the first. Socializing and play, not work and self-improvement, are the draw. Messaging apps help friends stay in touch and let migrant workers say goodnight to their children back home. People entertain their friends and strangers on social media with goofy homemade videos on YouTube or TikTok. Cheap data plans and thumb drives bring pirated films to millions who may have never been to a theater. Dating apps are more popular than farming advice, and video games are more popular than either. For businesses, the second half of the Internet offers a vast pool of customers. It also brings a headache. Most of these new users are too poor to spend very much. Tens of billions of dollars in venture capital money have flowed into Internet startups in emerging markets. The Silicon Valley giants have built up big user bases. Over 1.5 billion Facebook users are in developing countries. YouTube, that you're listening to this on, as you know, a video site owned by Google, is increasingly dominated by non-Western users. Recently, Walmart spent $16 billion buying Flipkart, an Indian e-commerce giant. Jumia, an e-commerce firm with 4 million customers in Nigeria and 13 other African countries. The few cities that dominate international financial activity, Frankfurt, Hong Kong, London, New York, are at the height of a modern global integration, which is to say, they are all relatively well connected with one another. But when you examine the numbers, the picture is one of extreme connectivity at the local level and not a flat world. What do such statistics reveal? Most types of economic activity that could be conducted either within or across borders still turn out to be quite domestically concentrated. The levels of internationalization associated with cross-border migration, telephone calls, management research and education, private charitable giving, patenting, stock investment and trade, as a fraction of the gross domestic product, GDP, all stand much closer to 10% than 100%. Into the more extreme, you would expect to see a world where national borders are irrelevant, where citizens increasingly view themselves as members of ever broader political entities. True, communication technologies have improved dramatically during the past 100 years. The cost of a 3-minute telephone call from New York to London fell from $350 in 1930 to about 40 cents in 1999 and is now approaching zero for VoIP technology. And the Internet itself is just one of many newer forms of connectivity that have progressed several times faster than plain old telephone service. The pace of improvement has inspired exciting proclamations about the pace of global integration. But it's argued that it's a huge leap to go from predicting such changes to asserting that declining communication costs will obliterate the effects of distance. Although the barriers at borders have declined significantly, they haven't disappeared. Trade flows certainly bear that theory out. Consider Canadian-U.S. trade, the largest bilateral relationship of its kind in the world. In 1988, before the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, took effect, merchandise trade levels between Canadian provinces, that is, within the country, were estimated to be 20 times as large as their trade with similarly sized and similarly distant U.S. states. In other words, there was a built-in home bias. Although NAFTA helped reduce this ratio of domestic to international trade, the home bias, by 10 to 1 by the 1990s, still exceeds 5 to 1 today. And these ratios are just for merchandise. For services, the ratio is still several times larger. Clearly, the borders in our seemingly borderless world still matter to people. Geographical boundaries are so pervasive, they even extend to cyberspace. If there were one realm in which borders should be rendered meaningless and the globalization proponents should be correct in their overly optimistic models, it should be the Internet. Yet, web traffic within countries and regions has increased far faster than traffic between them. Just as in the real world, Internet links decay with distance. People across the world may be getting more connected, but they aren't connecting with each other. The average South Korean web user may be spending several hours a day online, connected to the rest of the world in theory, but he's probably chatting with friends across town and emailing family across the country rather than meeting a fellow surfer in Los Angeles. We are more wired, but no more global. Just look at Google, which boasts of sporting more than 100 languages and, partly as a result, has recently been rated the most globalized website. But Google's operation in Russia reaches only 20% of the market there versus 64% for the Russian market leader in search activities, Yandex, and 53% for Rambler. Indeed, these two local competitors account for 91% of the Russian market for online ads linked to web searches. What has stymied Google's expansion into the Russian market? The biggest reason is the difficulty of designing a search engine to handle the linguistic complexities of the Russian language. In addition, these local competitors are more in tune with the Russian market. For example, developing payment methods through traditional banks to compensate for the absence of credit cards. And though Google has doubled its reach since 2003, it's had to set up a Moscow office in Russia and to hire Russian software engineers, underlining the continued importance of physical location. Even now, borders between countries define and constrain our movements more than globalization breaks them down. If globalization is an inadequate term for the current state of integration, there's an obvious rejoinder. Even if the world isn't quite flat today, it will be tomorrow. Now, to respond, let's have a look at trends, rather than levels of integration at any one point in time. The results are telling. Along a few dimensions, integration has reached an all-time high many years ago. For example, rough calculations suggest that the number of long-term international migrants amounted to 3% of the world's population in 1900, the high watermark of an earlier era of migration, versus 2.9% in 2005. Along other dimensions, it's true that new records are being set. But this growth has happened only relatively recently and only after long periods of stagnation and reversal. For example, FDI, or foreign direct investment stocks, divided by GDP, gross domestic product, peaked before World War I and didn't return to that level until the 1990s. Several economists have argued that the most remarkable development over the long term was the declining level of internationalization between the two world wars. And despite the records being set, the current level of trade intensity falls short of completeness, as the U.S.-Canadian trade data suggests. In fact, when trade economists look at these things, they're amazed at how much trade there is, but really how little. It's also useful to examine the considerable momentum that globalization proponents attribute to the constellation of policy changes that led many countries, particularly China, India, and the former Soviet Union, to engage more extensively in the international economy. One of the better researched descriptions of these policy changes and their implications is provided by economists Jeffrey Sachs and Andrew Warner. To quote, "The years between 1970 and 1999, and especially the last decade, have witnessed the most remarkable institutional harmonization and economic integration among nations in world history. While economic integration was increasing throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, the extent of integration has come sharply into focus only since the collapse of communism in 1989. In 1995, one dominant global economic system is emerging." Yes, such policy openings are important, but to paint them as a sea change perhaps is inaccurate at best. Integration is only beginning. The policies that we humans enact are surprisingly reversible. For example, if you look at the reformulation of NAFTA into the USMCA by the Trump administration, is one really excellent example. Stepping away from the Paris Accord is another example. Stepping away from the Iranian non-nuclear proliferation agreement is another. Decisions are often seemingly easily and quickly reversed. So, detractors suggest that champions of globalization are describing a world that really doesn't quite exist. Hey, it's a fine strategy, they say, to sell books and even describe a potential environment that may someday exist. Because such episodes tend to be relatively short-lived, even when they do achieve broad currency. One might simply be tempted to wait this one out. But the stakes are too high for that. Governments that buy into the flat world are likely to pay too much attention to what Friedman describes as the golden straitjacket, which is supposed to ensure that economics matters more and more and politics less and less. Buying into this version of an integrated world, using it as a basis for policy making, could be, unproductive and dangerous. Slide titled, Seminar Question Reintroduced. Opening today's newspaper, please select a news item that gives evidence of the advance or retreat of globalization as you now understand it by virtue of the elements described herein. Thank you.